The vertebral column. So the vertebral column is made up of various sections of bones that we call vertebra. The basic structure of the vertebra starts out with the body. You have the body of the vertebra. This is on the posterior, no, I'm sorry, this is anterior. This is on the anterior side of the body, the vertebra. So if you were doing a dissection of an organism and you opened up their thorax and you moved the heart and the lungs to the side, you would be looking at this surface of the vertebra. If you turn the organism over on its back and you feel along the spinous process is what makes the spine feel spiny along the back of a person's body. Right, so this is posterior. So all vertebrae have a spinous process, except for the top two. They kind of are exceptional. So you've got these processes, spinous process and transverse process. These are attached to one another via a thing called a lamina. So here are the lamina. So the processes are attached by a lamina, and the processes are attached to the body of the vertebra by the pedicle. You definitely need to know those structures. So the pedicle is the bridge between the body and the processes, and the lamina is the bridge between the spinous process and the transverse processes. So what is going to go through this hole? If you stack all the vertebrae up together, you form a vertebral canal. This is a vertebral foramen, but when you stack them all up together, you make a canal, and we call that structure the spinal cord. So the spinal cord that comes through the brain and gives off all your spinal nerves to the body travels through this opening. All right, so here your vertebra consists of the body. Yep, this is the weight-bearing portion of the spinal cord. These all stack together. They are separated by a fibrocartilage disc. So when you have a slip disc, it's fibrocartilage between the body of the vertebra that moves out of place and pinches a nerve that's coming out. Your pedicle and lamina. Remember, the pedicle joins the body to the processes, and the lamina joins the spinous process to the transverse process. And these form a vertebral arch. Your processes, points of attachment for muscles. So you have all these large muscles that move through the back of the body to help you move your spine, rotate your spine from left to right, etc. All right, so the vertebral column, you've got vertebra that go from the occipital bone into the neck, through the neck. Then you have the vertebra continuing down through your thorax. Then you have vertebra going down through the back of your abdomen. And then you have this bone, the sacrum, going, joining up the two sides of your pelvis. So these different regions are named based on where you find them. The cervical vertebrae, if you can guess, is found in the neck. This is why I emphasize y'all knowing these words, because it helps you remember where cervical vertebrae are to know the name, to know what cervical means. So cervical means neck. You've got 7 cervical vertebrae. So this is your occipital bone up here on the base of the skull. And then all the way through the neck, you've got 7 of these. So C1 through C7, they're called. We abbreviate them by calling the cervical vertebra, just abbreviating them with a C. Then you've got 12 thoracic vertebrae. What else do you have 12 of in the body? You have 12 ribs. Right, so your thoracic vertebra go through the thorax and each will articulate with a rib. Once you move past the thorax, past the ribs, then you are in the abdomen, and we call this area your lumbar region, and this is where you have your lumbar vertebra. So all of these different regions have differences in the structure of the vertebra. So all the vertebrae from these regions look a little bit different from each other because they have a different function. So in the cervical region, you have vessels that need to travel up into the brain. So the cervical vertebra will have what's called a transverse foramen or opening for those vessels to move up into the brain, like this. The thoracic vertebra don't have those vessels, but they have transverse processes with the articular facets for the ribs to attach to. Right, so you'll have a rib going off of each side of each 12 vertebra to the front of the body. So they look unique because of that, because they have those articular facets. The lumbar vertebrae are much larger because they are supporting the major weight of the body. They don't have those articular facets because there are no ribs down here, but they're just much bulkier and heavier, and they have a different structure themselves. All right, so to sum it all up, you've got 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then your sacrum, which joins the pelvis, the bones of the pelvis. And at the very end, you have your coccyx. So the coccyx is like, 3 little tiny bones, or one that are they could be fused, that make up your tailbone. So when looking at the vertebral column, it's important to understand that the vertebra fit together in a particular way that makes various types of foramen, right? And these, remember, are holes. Or the foramen come together to make canals. So we go from the cervical region, which is the neck, to the sacrum, which is that last bone of the vertebral column, aside from the coccyx. And when you fit these bones together, you can see these are thoracic vertebrae, and we know that because of the superior facets on here. Because of the facets for the ribs, right? So those are thoracic vertebrae. And when you place them together, they will form a long canal for the spinal cord called the vertebral canal, right? So the spinal cord will sit in the canal formed by multiple foramen that are stacked on top of one another. And then you have these foramen out by the side that are formed by putting together 2 vertebra, and these foramen will serve for the passage of spinal nerves. And the spinal nerves are the nerves that deliver neurons to your muscles and mostly your muscles and your skin for sensation and motor movement. Right, so each vertebra has a large vertebral foramen, and then between the vertebra, when you put 2 vertebrae together, you create this intervertebral foramen for the exiting of the spinal nerves. So between each foramen, or between each vertebral body, you have a vertebral disc, and this is what people describe when they talk about having a slip disc. So you can see if the disc between the vertebral bodies slips out or gets pinched or gets squished on the side, so you'd have a spinal nerve coming out of this intervertebral foramen here. It can actually put pressure on the spinal nerve, causing pain or loss of function of the spinal nerve. Right, and then this is showing you that you can have compression. So you have pressure from the weight of your body placed on the vertebra of the vertebral column, the bodies, and that's sometimes what leads to problems with the disc slipping out of place. Right, the discs are there to absorb shock, these fibrocartilage discs. And these should be very strong joints so that your backbone is able to resist a lot of stress. All right, so looking at the vertebral column from the lateral side, as you're developing in the womb as a fetus, the vertebral column begins as a curved, kind of like a curved inward C shape And as you grow up and develop, you'll have several curves in the vertebral column to help give you an upright posture. Right? So we say that there are 4 curves in the adult. This helps the adult appear that they're standing straight, but really the spinal column has a curved structure. All right, so this shows us that picture a little bit better. Your top cervical vertebra, C1 through C7, so those vertebrae form a convex curve, so going into the body, convex. The next vertebra, the T1 to T12, they form a concave curve, so away from the body. And then the next set of vertebrae, the lumbar, again, are the opposite of the thoracic, so they're going to curve, create a convex curve. And then at the very tail end, at the sacrum, you have another curvature, a concave curvature going towards the body. So you can see the different regions will curve in different directions to give you an upright posture. So cervical and lumbar are convex, which means they bulge outwards, bulge out towards the center of the body. And the thoracic and sacral curves are concave. So they cup inward towards the body. So here's a critical thinking question. So you're asked to explain how abnormal bone structure could affect muscle function first. All right, so for this question, you're going to think about what is the function of bones? Why are bones shaped the way that they are? So that if you have some kind of abnormal bone structure, how would it affect the muscles that are attached to it? Second question, Miss Gia has fractured the transverse process of her 4th thoracic vertebra. All right, so the transverse process, that's on the side. We're in the thoracic region, so that's where we have our ribs attached. She reports back pains and pain with movements such as breathing. Why would this happen? Why is there pain when she's breathing? So if we're in the 4th thoracic vertebra, you can think about what bones are articulating with the thoracic vertebra. And what is the function of those bones that articulate with the thoracic vertebra? And that should lead you to the answer. All right, so you can have abnormal curving in the spine, and when you have a lateral bend or shift in the spine, this is called scoliosis, which you've probably heard of before, and be treated with a back brace. And bones are responsive, so if you put some stress on them, if you try to reform the bone back in a more aligned direction, you can usually correct this condition to some point. The state of kyphosis is an overcurvature in the thoracic vertebra of the body. And then lordosis is an overcurvature, over convex curvature in the lower lumbar vertebra of the body. All right, so we're going to take a look at the vertebra in more detail. The first, so starting with your cervical vertebra, C1 through C7, at the neck, the first 2 vertebrae, C1 and C2, they look different than any of the other vertebrae. The C1 vertebra is going to have these articular facets. So if you remember where the vertebrae sit underneath the skull, remember we looked at the occipital bone, and the occipital bone had that giant foramen magnum in it for the spinal cord to come through. And then on each side, we had occipital condyles. And the occipital condyles, remember I told you, articulate with the facets on the C1 vertebra and allow you to nod your head up and down. All right, so also note on this vertebra, you don't you have a very small spinous process here. You have these little tiny foramen on the side, transverse foramen, or openings, holes. Those carry an artery that goes up to supply your brain with blood. And then when you place the C1, which is also called the atlas, when you place it on top of the C2, which is called the axis, you will have an articulation between this structure called the dens and this little facet. And if you can imagine placing these two together, you should be able to see that this is the joint that allows you to shake your head from left to right. Right? So you've got a joint between your occipital bone and your C1 with the occipital condyles and the facets here. That allows you to nod your head up and down, but then you have this little dens here on the axis that articulates with this facet, which allows you to move your head from left to right. All right, and that's demonstrated here because you've got the atlas, and then you can see the dens of the axis right here, and that will allow you to move this bone in this direction, back and forth in those directions. All right, so those two vertebrae look different than the others, but all cervical vertebrae have these transverse foramen on them. And again, this is an artery. This artery comes off in the neck and will travel up through these transverse foramen into the brain to give the brain blood. They're just called the vertebral arteries. There's one on each side. All right, so this is an artery that comes from the neck, travels up through the transverse foramen into the brain to supply the posterior aspect of the brain with blood. So, and the reason I'm noting that is because these transverse foramen are unusual and they really help you tell cervical vertebra apart from other types of vertebra, because other vertebra will not have these little transverse foramen on the sides. And you can't really see them on these vertebrae as much, but you can see it really boldly on the atlas or the C1. All right, so for your PowerPoint slide, it talks about the atlas holding up the head. And you can think about, the way I like to remember it is just by thinking about an atlas like the Earth, a map of the Earth, an atlas. And then the axis is the place that holds the globe up. You have an axis that holds up the Earth. All right, but this tells you that it provides a pivot, which basically is what I was telling you, allowing your head to move from left to right. All right, then you have your 12 thoracic vertebrae, and these are notable. You can tell these from the cervical. First of all, the spinous processes start to grow much larger at T1. The T1 spinous process, this process here, it'll look a lot more like the C7. But as you go down, they'll start to look more and more stout or fat in this direction. But yeah, the T1 is going to look more like the C7 spinous process. So you'll have spinous processes changing shape as you move down into the lumbar region. So they'll go from being long to kind of being fat and square when you get down into the close to the lumbar region. So the T12 is going to look a lot more like the L1 vertebra, which would sit here. All right, so they do change their shape and down, but the distinct difference between your thoracic vertebra and your lumbar vertebra are these articular facets, right? And these are facets that the rib, so if you stick T1 and T2 together, the rib will articulate with that facet, and then will articulate first with this facet, and then it'll come around, form another articulation point on the body of the vertebra, and then wrap around to the front of the body. Right, so you'll notice that if you look at the skeleton. So again, you have an articular part of the tubercle of the rib, so a little bump on the very end of it, and then it'll come around, form another bump, go around to the front of the body where it will join up to the sternum. As you can see, moving down, as these vertebrae get larger, the articular facet for the ribs, they are shared by multiple vertebrae, but as you move down, the vertebrae start to be large enough to accommodate the entire facet per vertebral body. All right, and now the lumbar vertebra, they're just notable because they have this very fat, no articular facets, and for the ribs, because there's no ribs attaching in this part of the body. They have these very fat spinous processes, and their transverse processes articulate with the spinous process. So you can kind of see that here, and if you look at it in the lab, you'll be able to see that even more. So try to remember, they're going to be much stouter because they're bearing more weight than the vertebra above them. So they're just really heavy-duty vertebra. If you turn them around and look at them from behind, they look like a moose head. You just have to trust me. They look like a moose head. Whereas with the thoracic vertebra, they look more like a giraffe. So when you're in lab, compare looking forward, looking straight at the thoracic vertebra versus looking at the lumbar vertebra, and you'll see they kind of take on the shapes of those animal faces. All right, the sacral vertebra are basically large, very enlarged, fused vertebra. And so they kind of have, you'll see some structures that, part of the structure is similar to the vertebral bodies above them, but you've got these large kind of wings called sacral ali. And you have these little foramen here called posterior sacral foramen. So you have them running down. And then you've got this sacral canal. So what happens is the spinal cord, it'll end somewhere around L1. So the spinal cord actually terminates up here. Let's see, terminates about L1, L2. That'll be the very end of the spinal cord. But you'll still have spinal nerves, so little strings coming from the very end of the spinal cord that will come off at each level. And then the very tail of them will travel through that sacral canal. So this thing right here, they'll travel through it. You'll have little tiny nerves coming out of these sacral foramen. And then at the very end, there is a little string from the spinal column that will anchor itself at the very base of the vertebra. Right, so you've got these leftover spinal nerves, no spinal column. You don't have the actual cord in there, which is the fat body, but you just have the nerves that are coming off of it. Traveling through there, one will come out of the foramen along the side, and then at the very end, you'll have a string that's not a nerve, but it's a leftover piece that will anchor itself to the base of the sacrum. And then at the very bottom, your little coccyx, which is like your tailbone. All right, so the final segment of the bony spine, and you have fusion of 3 to 5 little tiny vertebrae. So the thoracic cage is formed from the thoracic vertebra, so T1 to T12. Whoops. T1 to T12. And these are only the vertebrae that have a articular facet for a rib. And then each rib that articulates with the vertebra. And then in the very front, you'll have your sternum that articulates with the ribs. And the sternum is just a flat bone. So you've got your thoracic vertebra, your sternum, the ribs, and also what are called costal cartilages. So hopefully you remember that costal is another kind of name that refers to ribs. And some of the ribs towards the lower end will attach to the sternum, so around this area, we're looking in the front of the body, will actually attach to the sternum via these costal cartilages. And you'll see that better now that you know to look out for it. So the thoracic cage really functions to enclose and protect your organs, your heart, your lungs, and some of those great vessels that travel through. Also, so your diaphragm is a flat muscle that sits anchored and actually goes up into the ribs. And you also have part of your stomach and your liver, which are protected by those ribs. The thoracic column also provides an anchor of support for your upper limb. So remember, we talked about this is the appendicular skeleton, clavicle, scapula, and the humerus. And those are not touching the ribs. The clavicle is articulated with the sternum on the front of the body. And that's the only point at which they touch. Right? Your thoracic cage has not only the ability to protect those organs, but there are muscles between each rib going in different orientations that help you breathe in and breathe out. So when you breathe in, the whole thoracic cage expands, and when you breathe out, it shrinks, and that allows for the lungs inside to shrink and to grow and shrink along with the thoracic cage. Right, so at the very front of the thoracic cage, you have the sternum. So here is the sternum. And at the very top, you have the manubrium of the sternum. That's this bone right here. It's a flat bone. It has a notch called the suprasternal notch. You can feel this bone if you position your finger in the center of your body at the base of your neck. You can actually feel that little groove or notch. All right, and then the manubrium will articulate or touch with the body of the vertebra. So here's the body of the sternum. And then you have at the very end a little piece of bone that oftentimes gets fused, but sometimes isn't, fused to the body, called the xiphoid process. You've got your body, your xiphoid process, and your manubrium. And those make up the three sections of the sternum. Now remember, the sternum is what is articulating with the clavicle at the shoulder joint and all the ribs. Some of the ribs directly, but then some of the ribs through the costal cartilage. So maybe not as directly, but all the ribs at some point will go back into the manubrium. The sternum. So up here, it tells you there's a clavicular notch. So hopefully you can think, what would articulate with the clavicular notch? The clavicle. That's easy enough. So you'll have the clavicle articulating here. It'll go around like this, and then it'll attach to the scapula, which is that triangular bone on your back. And then you'll have your humerus. All right, so there's your clavicular notch where the clavicle attaches. And then underneath, you'll have a facet. You'll have the facets or the attachment points for the first rib, the second rib, third rib, fourth rib, fifth rib. All right, so there's you've got your manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. 12 pairs of ribs, and then costal cartilage, which is made of hyaline cartilage. Right, and the costal cartilage, remember, because it's hyaline, it's more elastic. It's not fiber cartilage. It's more rubbery, that kind of cartilage that you see between your movable joints. So it's going to help absorb, more movement, and it's going to be more flexible than your fiber cartilage would be. All right, so this is kind of what this looks like in the body. Well, it is what it looks like. So you've got the manubrium, the manubrium of the sternum, the suprasternal notch, that little hole that you can feel, that little groove you can feel at the very top of your neck or the very bottom of your neck, Then you can see the clavicle articulating at the clavicular notch. There's the clavicle. There's a articulation of the body with the first rib and the costal cartilage of the first rib. So here's the first rib itself, and there's the costal cartilage of the first rib. Here's the second rib, the costal cartilage of the second rib and costal cartilage. Third rib, where it attaches to the body of the manubrium. Fourth rib through its costal cartilage. So the costal cartilage is a kind of, in this body, this would be a real body, and the costal cartilage looks a little hardened, and sometimes it will harden in the body and kind of turn to bone in a very older individual. But it's turned yellow because it's not quite bone, so it's maybe dried out cartilage. And then you've got articulations for the fourth, and then the fifth. And then once you get down to ribs 6 through 10, they will all articulate through a single piece of costal cartilage. So here's that single piece. All right, so that's ribs 6 through 10. And then at the very bottom, the last two ribs, because you have 12 ribs, these are called floating ribs because they don't actually make contact with the sternum. And then there's your xiphoid process. We probably have a slide on this. Yep. So our true ribs are the ribs that will go directly from the vertebral column and through their costal cartilage will attach directly to the manubrium, right? So that's why it says the true ribs attach directly to the sternum or the manubrium, just the top part of the sternum. So there's rib 1 attached to the sternum. All right, or attached to the manubrium. The false ribs, these are, so this is ribs 1 through 5. Now 6 through 10 are false, and they're called false ribs because they attach via a shared piece of costal cartilage to the very bottom of the sternum. Right? So those would be your false ribs from here to really here. And then you've got your floating ribs, which are the two at the very bottom that are not attached to the sternum. All right, so now is a good time to review all the bones that you have gone over, that we've gone over in the lecture, and to practice learning them yourself. Skull, you've got the cranial bones, the facial bones, your clavicle, scapula, the thoracic cage, which is made up of the sternum. What were the bones of the sternum? The ribs, what are the true ribs, the false ribs, and the floating ribs? The vertebral column, what were the different vertebrae? How many vertebrae make up the cervical region? How many vertebrae make up the thoracic or the lumbar region? And then the sacral region. So this is our axial skeleton. All right, and then you can kind of review the bones of the appendicular skeleton to help you with the next part of the lecture. All right, so bones of the appendicular skeleton, which include the clavicle, the scapula, the humerus, the ulna and the radius, the carpals, which make up the wrist, the metacarpals of the palm, and the phalanges, which are the fingers. Your lower limb, including your pelvis, femur, tibia and fibula, tarsal bones, metatarsals, and phalanges of the feet. So one more critical thinking question to finish us off. If Jeffrey is in a car accident, if he can't open his mouth and suffers from the following: black eye, broken nose, broken cheek, broken upper jaw, and a punctured lung. What are the bones that he's damaged? So maybe pause the video and try to figure out what bones he's damaged. Make a little list, and then I can go through it with you guys. All right, so the eye. So we know he can't open his mouth. He has a black eye, a broken nose, a broken cheek, a broken upper jaw, and a punctured lung. All right, so for his mouth, if he can't open his mouth, what was the bone that you used to open your mouth? The mandible. The mandible is the lower part of the jaw. You use it to open your mouth. All right, so we can conclude probably he's got some kind of damage to his mandible. What about the black eye? So maybe he's just bruised there, but he's been hit in the eye. So you think about all the bones that make up your orbit. All right, so you can draw your orbit out. At the very top, you had your frontal bone. Frontal. Very top of the orbit. Then coming up the sides, on this side you had your top of your cheekbone, your zygomatic bone. At the very bottom, going up, is the maxilla. There was the nasal opening. So this is maxilla, so you could have damaged that. And then up at the very top, where you had nasal bones, you had the lacrimal bone here, the little lacrimal canal. You might have damaged this lacrimal bone. All right, you could see the sphenoid from, you've got ethmoid here, and then very in the center you have your superior orbital fissure, which was that little opening, and you had your lesser wing of the sphenoid and the greater wing of the sphenoid at the very bottom. All right, so for the black eye, maybe he's had some kind of damage to the bones around the orbit. The broken nose suggests that either he's broken his nasal bone or maybe he's broken the ethmoid bone. Remember the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone comes down and touches the vomer, which is down here. So he might have broken his vomer. Broken cheek, that would be the zygoma. He's definitely broken his zygoma bone. The upper jaw, remember the maxilla had all the teeth in it. Definitely broken his maxilla. And a punctured lung. So in order for something to puncture his lung, it would either have to break a rib, or it would have to go directly between the ribs and break the muscle between the ribs. It's probably likely that he's broken a rib because the ribs are in the way protecting the lung. And that's it for this lecture.